Hello, my beautiful, wonderful children. How are you doing? What's going on in your world? What are your problems? Comment them down below. Forbes came out with a most essential fantasy list. Now, they titled it something else, but if you read the description of the article, it actually is just essential, not best of all time. Literally, it's titled the best fantasy novels of all time, but if you look, it says the following novels and series are not an exhaustive look at the best fantasy novels of all time, but rather a sampling taken from various eras from the past to the present. There are many more terrific fantasy books out there for you to read, but these are some of the essentials. So it's the essentials, and that's different from best of all time. And let's get into this, because I think it actually is a pretty good list, though I am going to talk about which ones I'd substitute in for a few of their picks. Let's dive into this. But quickly, a word from this video's sponsor. Raid Shadow Legends is epic dark fantasy done right. With over 15 million downloads in the last 6 months, Raid Shadow Legends is making a splash in the fantasy community. And that's not just because of the incredible combat system, 400 champions to choose from, or the fact that it's free to play. No, it's kind of an amalgamation of all those things, plus many other awesome features. I like taking advantage of the multi-battle auto mode, where you can kind of set your phone down, let your champions do their thing, and cut down on grinding and just reap the rewards. Check out these incredible Halloween-themed champions that were just added to the game. So go to the video description, click on the special links, and if you're a new player, you will get 100,000 silver, 2 clan boss keys, 10 mystery shards, and 1 free champion, the Executioner. So hurry up and go down to the description and click those links, because these rewards are only relevant for the next 30 days. Lord of the Rings. Just duh. Don't need to talk about this much. It's the monolith. It's the influence. It's the granddaddy. All your favorite fantasy series that came after it are its spawn. Moving on. And a great pick is up next for the modern fantasy genre. If we're going for essentials from different eras, they're obviously going for an alternative modern fantasy pick here, and they chose The Lies of Locke Lamora, which is fantastic. The first entry in the Gentleman Bastard series is a masterpiece, in my opinion. Scott Lynch knocked it out of the park, and this pick alone makes me respect this list and like it. I wouldn't sub this one out for sure, and in terms of essential fantasy, if you want to be well read in the genre, this is a great look at alternative modern fantasy, in my opinion. The Last Unicorn by Peter S. Beagle. They're going for the younger audience pick here, the kids book within fantasy. I'm not going to bash picking The Last Unicorn. Wonderfully well written. There are definitely other picks that could go here. Harry Potter, His Dark Materials, etc., etc. And I won't necessarily substitute it, but I will say, in terms of picks, I think there are a lot of people who will bulk at The Last Unicorn because they don't feel it's as influential or essential necessarily as Harry Potter, His Dark Materials, what have you. I personally would swap this out with Harry Potter, and I won't necessarily substitute it, and I won't necessarily substitute it, and I won't necessarily substitute it. I personally would swap this out with Harry Potter due to the fact that Harry Potter essentially started YA in a lot of ways, or at least propelled it to what it is now, and fantasy's obsession with having a broad selection of YA choices, trying to grab onto that cash stack that Harry Potter originally tapped into. Next up, a pick I don't think will anger anybody, Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson. In terms of quintessential modern fantasy, I don't think this is bad at all. In fact, I think this is the proper choice in a lot of ways. If you want to go to what is the broad appeal, massively loved, critically praised fantasy happening now, Mistborn's a fantastic representation of that fantasy story we're digging currently. It's representative of the rise of female characters no longer being in the background or just in distress all the time. It's very well written, it's concise, it has a nice arc, growth, character work. Mistborn is an essential read if you'd like to be a well-rounded fantasy nerd in the modern day and age, I believe. No swap out. Next up, they have one unfortunately I can't speak on. I can't even say what they're trying to go for here. Tigana by Guy Gavriel Kay. It seems interesting. I've heard of it, but I can't say what they're going for necessarily. Or really speak on should you read it. But I know if I was going to go for an essential fantasy list, I would want to recommend some foreign fantasy, some stuff that's definitely outside the box, showing what other cultures can bring. For that, I'm going to go with Master and Margarita, a Russian fantasy absurdist story that is purely brilliant, and I think is an essential fantasy read, because if you want to know what fantasy can do when it's not viewed in its traditional sense, but you have a lot of those elements in terms of vampires, the devil, and it is definitely an allegory for Russia at the time, you can see what is largely critically praised as one of the best stories written. Master and Margarita is just something everyone should read, even outside of being a fantasy nerd, but I do believe is essential fantasy when realizing the importance of the genre being able to enhance storytelling. And when you want to have a examination of your own time, explore themes that are happening in a society around you, the fantasy skinning that many authors can pull on do not inhibit that at all. They enhance if done properly. And there is no better example of that I can think of than Master and Margarita, except debatably Lord of the Rings. That one as well could be, it's an amazing examination of post-World War I Europe, but still. Next up, I believe they're just trying to have another, this is a great example of modern fantasy, but oddly they're not choosing the King Killer Chronicles. No, they're specifically picking the Name of the Wind. Even though up until this point it's been series, this person is only recommending The Name of the Wind, and they even note that the second book has not been as well praised. Unfortunately, I cannot agree with this placement, and I'm going to go with my pure biased hack fraud. I love it, and I'm going to shove it down your throat as much as possible. Pick The Wheel of Time. And I think if you're just going to have another example of great modern fantasy, let's show a series that really helped bridge between what was classic fantasy and modern. The Wheel of Time has a lot of elements from classic fantasy, but the character work, the theming, the plot development we see from modern more often. So for that reason, I'm going to go ahead and substitute Wheel of Time in, and I'm not going to talk about it a whole lot more because I know many people want to punch me in the face because I talk about too much. Next up, they have what I would just consider the blockbuster pick. What is actually having the most influence right now? What are the most people ripping off? And obviously that leads them to choosing A Song of Ice and Fire. Not a bad pick by any means. It is incredible. A Song of Ice and Fire is probably having the largest splash for the fantasy genre it has seen since The Lord of the Rings in terms of changing things up, causing more adaptations to come down the road than we've ever seen before. And no, I'm not going to swap this one out. This is a good pick because A Song of Ice and Fire is great fantasy. It's anti-fantasy, which I think should be on this list as well, show what the opposite can be. And it's also having this blockbuster smash hit appeal that is totally earned. Next up, we have Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, which unfortunately I have not read. And I don't know what they're necessarily trying to go for here. After a brief Google search, I saw historical was in a couple of the genres, historical fiction, historical fantasy. And if that's what they want to have in this list, one, I don't necessarily think that subgenre of fantasy is essential. And I already did cover that a bit with the Master and Margarita. So I'm just going to come in with a completely different, I believe this is essential fantasy recommendation. So instead, what I'm going to recommend here is the best sci-fantasy. Undoubtedly, sci-fi and fantasy have had an intertwined relationship and often cross over into each other, to a point where I do believe if you want to be a well-read fantasy nerd, you need to read sci-fi to an extent. And there's no better example of this than one I don't personally love but respect immensely, and that is Dune. Dune is essential fantasy. It's also essential sci-fi. It's essential sci-fantasy, and I believe belongs on all three lists, to be honest. But if you have not read it, I highly recommend you do, and link to buy it and every other book I mentioned here in the description down below with an affiliate link that'll help support the channel. Dune covers a sweeping setting in one of the largest empires ever brought to fiction. It has incredible themes, decent characters is what I will give it, but really did set the standard and shift a whole lot of things for both genres in terms of what was attempted and successfully captured in the page. While Frank Herbert's writing style grates with me to a point where I can't enjoy this book on the level it deserves, I am still going to recommend it and recognize it for what it is, a masterpiece. Unfortunately, up next on their list they have another entry I can't speak on, The Darkness That Comes Before. I don't know if this is worth reading, and I can't speak on what they're going for. But I do know what I would recommend here. We've covered classic fantasy, but not enough. We need another recommendation from back in the day. Sure, Lord of the Rings and Dune are getting older, but there is more to older fantasy than those two. And for me, this spot goes to The Once and Future King. While the influence of the Arthurian legend is not felt currently in the fantasy genre on the scale it used to the point where adaptations of Arthurian legends flop pretty much by default, it's important. It had a massive push on the genre as a whole for decades. And T.H. White's The Once and Future King, while I only recently read it, has given me a whole new appreciation for what the Arthurian legend can be, its themes, its messaging, and yes, it is essential fantasy, and I'm ashamed I put it off for so long. And the final pick Forbes comes in with here is not one I will substitute, because I agree that Grimdark is important to understand fantasy currently. Grimdark has had a rise as a result of A Song of Ice and Fire. Not entirely, but largely. You can't argue with the fact that A Song of Ice and Fire has filled that pool in a large way. But they picked what I do believe to be the strongest entry the Grimdark subgenre of fantasy has ever seen, and that is the First Law trilogy. Joe Abercrombie's ability to make you love characters you should disdain with every fiber of your being is awesome. And he understands the soul of Grimdark. It's not about just being as gory and horrific as possible. Joe Abercrombie understands that Grimdark is not torture porn. Instead, it's the idea that good does not always win, that people can be morally awful to each other and come out on top. The hero of the age doesn't always win. It's more complex than that. That theming has never been captured or examined better within the fantasy genre, in my mind, than with Joe Abercrombie's The First Law trilogy. Absolute essential read in my mind for the current state of the genre. So let me know in the comments down below, what did you think of this list? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Let me know down below. I will have a link to all of these books if you'd like to purchase them down there in the description, as well as a link to today's sponsor, of course, Raid Shadow Legends, if you'd like to sign up and join me in engaging in one of the fastest growing fantasy apps out there, without a doubt. Anyway, guys, thank you so much. Like and subscribe if you have not already. Hit the Patreon if you want to support what I do here, and I will be working heavily on my next and last short story before diving back into my main book soon. And so the Patrons will be having that before too long. Have a good one, y'all. Peace. And of course, I'd like to record a special shout out to my latest high tier Patreons. First among servants, and let me try and pronounce this right, Giancarlos Castellano. I hope I said that right, man. Thank you guys so much. Have a good one.